Most people learn American history through presidents, wars, and big political moments. But what if the real story of America is about workers, strikes, and the struggle for power? Welcome to History Secrets Uncovered. My name is Jay Chandarana, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Erik Loomis, a historian of labor, capitalism, and inequality at the University of Rhode Island. Professor Loomis, thank you so much for joining me.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
To start, what first drew you to studying labor history and the experiences of workers?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I grew up in a working class household. My dad worked in the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest, so I grew up not wealthy, and it was a time of, and this was the 1980s and the early 1990s when I was a kid, and so it was a time of a big dramatic economic changes that weren't necessarily very good for working class people. And then I went to college and had some experiences, and I ended up living in Knoxville, Tennessee, for a few years in the late 1990s, where I got involved with a bunch of people who were engaged in labor organizing and labor issues. And I was already kind of inclined to thinking about the world in those terms. And I became involved in some campaigns to improve wages in Tennessee, and then to bring union rights to workers at the University of Tennessee. And so I kind of got involved in that on a personal level, and sort of it really spoke to me to think about the world in terms of class, and in terms of trying to create a better life for the majority of people. And so then when I decided to do a PhD in history, and I began to think about what I wanted to write about and specialize in and do the things that professional historians do, I was really drawn to these issues of labor, and particularly the industry in which I grew up around in the Pacific Northwest, and so in the timber industry. And so I began to work onto that, and then I started writing, a little bit more publicly and popularly, and trying to reach out to broader audiences about working class issues, and that kind of brings us to me writing these books.
And when most Americans and students learn American history in schools, labor really isn't the central focus. We talk about wars, we talk about battles, we talk about presidents. What does that narrative kind of leave out of our nation's story?
Well, yeah, it leaves out a lot. I mean, for one thing, it leaves out critical parts of the lived experience of Americans then, now, and in the future, right? Work is something that we all share, right? We're all going to be working in some form or another. We all have worked in some form or another. And, there are this kind of narrative of great men doing things. It does a couple of things, right? It serves the interests of those who are in power, who think of themselves as great men, and people who change the world. And of course, certain powerful people can change the world, yes, but it ignores the broader context of how those changes happen. It ignores why those changes happen, why people look toward particular people to be presidents, for example. I mean, I think that a question that future historians will be asking for a long time is, why did Americans choose Donald Trump as their president, right? I mean, that's a pretty big question that people are going to be thinking about for a very, very long time. And but I think that the other side of that again is that there are experiences that unite us all, right? All societies in human history have had some form of work. All societies in human history have had some form of religion or spirituality. All societies in human history have some ideas of gender roles, whatever those might be. And I think that by focusing on the experiences that we all share, it brings us into our history. It brings us all into the shaping of what America has become. Because the way that America is today, for good or for negative, depending on how you feel about it, or some combination of it, is not because this president did this or this president did that. It's because the masses of Americans made a bunch of choices around everything from, their favorite soda to the sports that the sports that became popular in America, to their choices when it came to fashion, to ideas about travel, to the jobs they had. And it's those choices in combination with each other that really create the world in which we've lived in. So I think that focusing on the lived experiences of the masses of people provides us a much more nuanced, interesting, and accurate understanding of the past and the present than a bunch of focuses on wars and rich guys and presidents.
So it helps us overestimating the importance of individuals and helps us embrace the importance of the collective, us as a nation.
Yes. Right. Yes. I mean, I think that this endless focus on powerful individuals really serves as perhaps a psychological need that people have to feel about leadership and that somebody can save us from problems that seem really complicated. But the truth is, and this is what labor history shows, is that for working class people, no leader is ever going to save you, right? We have to save ourselves collectively only through organizing each other and being in solidarity with one another and working with each other to try to make a better life for all of us can we make the changes that will provide us a more dignified life in the future. And that's very much the story, or a big part of the story anyway, of the American labor movement.
And your work emphasized that a lot, that ordinary workers have to take control and have taken control in shaping the country. In what ways have labor movements influenced American political and economic systems?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, if you think about the world in which we live in right now, right, where, at least the ideal is an 8-hour day, you have when you get old, you have Social Security. If you get sick, you have Medicare or Medicaid. You have this social safety net, limited as it may be. You have a minimum wage. You have overtime pay if you work certain kinds of jobs. If you're 12 years old, you're not going into the factories anymore. All of these things were driven by, or at least in part, by the labor movement, right? That workers came together and, in many, tried over and over and over again, often failing, in the 19th century, early 20th century, to do things like create an 8-hour day, to create a minimum wage, to get children out of the workplace, right? And they often lost those battles, right? But by continuing to organize and then really being able to do successfully during the Great Depression in the 1930s, they were able to become an important constituency in American political life with the power, at least to a certain extent, to elect or not elect politicians and to gain concrete promises and actions from politicians that then paid off by those politicians taking the concerns of the working class seriously. And so building a union, making the workplace better, safer, more dignified, creating consequences for sexual harassment on the job, not firing women workers for getting pregnant on the job, not having child labor. All of these different things are a result of working class people coming together and organizing themselves and influencing the political system.
Now, in a history of America and 10 strikes, your work revolves around strikes not being just economic events and labor movements. How did these movements challenge existing power structures, especially between workers, corporations, and governments as a whole?
Right. Well, a strike is a big action, right? So, many of your listeners may not have seen a strike. They're a little more common now than they were 10 or 15 years ago, but they're still not super common. And so a strike is when workers at a given workplace choose collectively to withhold their labor, to say, we will not go in and work for this person or this company because they are treating us unfairly. They are not giving us a fair wage or hours or working conditions or benefits or whatever it might be, right? People can strike over anything. Now, and this has, of course, the potential to put a big, shutdown on the economy, especially if enough workers are involved. It's enough firms, enough industries, this sort of thing. And particularly in some powerful industries, the shutdown, let's say, of the airlines, for example, if the airlines shut down for a long period of time, that would put a significant crimp in the American economy, right? And so, workers coming together and shutting down a piece of the economy is a challenge to employer power and to the political system, right? The question is, how does a political system respond to that, right? And I think that one of the things that is important to understand about America, because, the United States does not have the robust social welfare system of Western European nations, right? And some other nations around the globe in Asia, for example. And part of the reason for that is for various reasons that we may not have time to get into. American employers and the American government, and here we're talking at the federal, the state, and the local levels, as well as the court systems, have tended to often work in lockstep, right? And so, employers will put people or get people elected that will, do what they want them to do, which is to rule or to legislate against unions. So if you go on strike, you have to be able to defeat that alliance between corporate America and the political class, right? Which is often supported by the media, often supported by the police, often supported by other wealthy people, and it's a lot for people to overcome. I mean, it's very difficult to win a strike. I mean, it really is a brave action. But I think that hopefully what the book shows is that with two things. I mean, I think it shows that even if you lose a strike, and many strikes in America have been lost, and we don't have to romanticize that to still understand that what's happening is important, that they still challenge power, and they still create they lay the groundwork for future victories, right? So 1886 is a period of enormous strikes around the 8-hour day. Those are mostly defeated, but over time, beginning really in the 1910s and then put into law in the 1930s, the 8-hour day becomes the norm, right? So this is the kind of action that can make a long-term difference. But if you can get the government to be neutral, to just be an arbitrator between the government, the strikers and the employers, strikers can win huge gains, which is a big part of the story of the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, when the American working class rose in their economic power and political power tremendously, something really began to end by the 70s, but you saw that working class start to look something more like the middle class. And that is a titanic and really revolutionary change in the lived experience of millions of Americans.
And a lot of the times when we talk about strikes, it stems from a place of economic inequality. I mean, we see a typical back in the 1800s, like the laissez-faire approach to an economic system. Do you think economic inequality today is fundamentally different than it has been in the past, or are we seeing history repeating itself in patterns?
Well, history doesn't really his hold on a second here. History doesn't really. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, sorry, we had a little internet issue on my end. I apologize. So I wouldn't say history repeats itself, but because this doesn't really do that. But what we are seeing today is the actual statistics of economic inequality is the highest it's been in 100 years. We have today what's called a K-shaped economy, in which the wealthy are doing amazing and making enormous gains. I mean, those kind of tech billionaires that exist today that did not even exist 20 years ago is an enormous change in America. But for the most people, the K, right? So that's like the up K, the down K. Like everyday people are not doing very well, and that explains a lot of the anger in America today, and a lot of the political anger that is entering into our systems in all kinds of ways, many of which are not very healthy, I don't think. You know, but one of the big reasons why you have this rise in economic inequality today, or this political anger, is that working people don't have their unions anymore, right? The union rates in this country are down to slightly under 10%, or right at about 10% of American workers are unionized. If you're in the private sector, i.e., you don't work for the government, that's about 6%. And so, what unions did is they provided a path for working class people to channel their politics into a way that was going to help them, right? That was going to bring a more equal society, right? That was going to make sure that working people had, if the pie grew, that working people were going to get their share of that pie. That did not necessarily mean revolution or anything like that, right? There were, of course, some unions that called for things like this, but for the most part, it was about getting their fair share of that economic pie. But in beginning of the 1970s, there began to be an attack on the American labor movement. Unions lost a lot of battles, a lot of jobs disappeared that were unionized, new jobs appeared that were not unionized, and not surprising, with a weaker union movement, that working class frustration has grown, and there is not an obvious way for most working class people to channel their political dissatisfaction, or to figure out, why is it that I am so poor? Why is it that my life is not what it could be? Why is it that my health care is not good, and like I'm not getting the health care I need or my family needs, right? And so, and with so the unions kind of provide a pathway for that. Not having that, you have a much higher level of inequality, so it's definitely connected. But you also have it also generates this kind of anger that can even enter into violence. that you increasingly see in our society today. So, I mean, one of the things that unions actually do provide is a way to siphon off that political anger and channel it in ways that is more productive and create a more peaceful and equitable America.
Sure, and we see like a decrease in unions in the modern day. Do you think this relates to the younger generation rethinking work and labor in ways that differ from the past?
Not really. I think that it's really was about the decline of unions are really about a conscious effort to shutter union factories and move them into places that do not have unions, right? So the real, if anything, young people, I think, are more, especially people, say 30 or 35 and under, are much more pro-union, and you see that in the polling around unions. It doesn't mean they're able to form unions successfully, but it's very clear that for young people, the idea of a union is much more appealing than it was for people of my generation or my parents' generation. And you really, have to go back to like the 1930s and 40s to see comparable rates of union approval. The reason that unions are so weak today is a very intentional attack. So, we had auto factories, steel, all these other industries that were unionized, but companies realized that they could shut those factories down, move production either to very rural and poor parts of the American South or overseas, first to Mexico and then to Central America and Asia, increasingly Africa and other places, to find the lowest rates and the most complicit political class who will allow these corporations to exploit workers like we exploited American workers 100 years ago. And while there has been gains in some parts of the workplace with unions, particularly government workers, and now a little bit of service workers, it has not nearly made up for the millions of union jobs lost. And so I think that, there is the possibilities to reestablish a strong labor movement in this country, but it's going to take a lot because the workplace is so fundamentally different than it was in the 1930s and 40s and 50s when we built those jobs. But if I do have any hope, it is in fact younger people.
Do you think that's a shift that we will see in the next few generations, a shift more towards unions again, or?
It's very difficult to say. I think that the continued interest in unions is very powerful, but corporate America and the courts have really captured the process for successfully forming unions that make it very difficult in order to actually win one. So it's legal, for instance, to your workers say they want a union, the company can call in workers and basically engage in propaganda campaigns against them, and that's completely legal. Threaten to fire them. They can't fire them technically, but if they do fire union workers, it's hard for them to actually get their jobs back, etc. You also have the rise of AI. How is that going to affect work? I think that's very much an open question right now. So I don't really predict the future. What I can say, though, with some confidence, is that an American people that does not feel comfortable economically, does not feel like they're getting a fair share of the pie, does not feel like they're living in a system that treats them fairly, are quite likely to react very strongly against that, whether that's through traditional political means or it's through violence. It's hard to say. It could be a variety of things, but I think it's in everybody's interest, even if sometimes they don't see it, with the rich, to actually encourage unions to grow and encourage unions in their own workplaces because it leads to a happier workforce, a more productive workforce, a more profitable workforce, and one that's more stable.
And I think that stability is super important, especially in terms of another option being potentially violence instead. That stability is it grounds that even rich people who might see unions as worse for them economically, something better in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're in a scenario right now that's a lot like it was in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s, a period called the Gilded Age, in which you had the growth of you had this explosive wealth growth and a real contempt by those few people who had gained access to that wealth to workers making any claim upon it. And so back then, the corporations would just, if workers went on strike, they would kill them. They would, in some cases, they would use strike breakers. They would have the police beat them. They would imprison them. I mean, all kinds of things. What this inevitably led to was situations of real violence, such as in 1901, when an anarchist, a political radical named Leon Saglas, walked up to the President of the United States, William McKinley, and shot him in the stomach and killed him. Or in 1910, when a union and a generally very respectable labor union, not one that was politically radical, the Iron Workers Union, decided that the newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, of course still around today, was so anti-union they blew up the LA Times building. They set a bomb and it killed like 25 people. So part of the, so but there's this contempt among the rich today toward the idea that they owe workers anything at all, right? That all of that profit should not be contained in them. And, like a century ago, I mean, you saw this a couple of years ago where a healthcare CEO, I guess it was about a year and a half ago now, where some guy walked up and assassinated a healthcare CEO because he
Yeah.
felt that this CEO of, I guess it was United Healthcare, forgive me if I'm wrong about that, but I think it was,
Yeah.
uh, decided that this CEO was exploiting people and hurting them and leading them to death because they were not properly, paying out insurance claims and things like this. And unfortunately, I think that if you don't bring workers into the system, and that was one of the lessons of the 1930s and 40s, you had to bring workers into the system in order to create a stable system that you're going to see people respond with desperation. And it's a very unfortunate and almost always going to end very badly for everybody involved. But we can see that happening again.
Thank you. And to wrap up, one final question. What do you think people today most misunderstand about the relationship between labor, power, and democracy?
I think they don't understand that a healthy labor movement is central to a functioning democracy. That you have to, if you want a democracy where people, the idea of a democracy, right, is that everybody or most of the people feel that they are invested in the nation, that win or lose, the nation more or less is going to work for them. Right. And if that doesn't happen, if people do not feel invested in it, the democracy begins to fail. Right. And, we've seen this. We've seen democratic backsliding in significant ways this century in the United States, in your lifetime, in the lifetime of many of your listeners. And so, if you go to sort of international statistics that rank nations by the amount of democracy, the United States is plummeting down that list because people do not believe, many people do not believe that this country works for them anymore and are looking for some kind of way out and this gets back to the leadership question, some kind of savior, some kind of person who's going to solve their problems for them. The political class had largely failed to do that for a very, very, very long time. And so if you want a nation that's stable, if you want a nation that your kids are going to grow up in and live a good life, you need to have working class people invested in the nation to have access to power, to have access and a belief that the world is going to get better for them. And the way to do that is to encourage them to have unions, to bring those unions into decision-making processes for the employer, to make it easier to form those unions, to negotiate fairly around wages, because for the most part, for the most part, most companies could definitely afford to have a union in their place. The real issue is not that causes so much tension between employers and workers that want unions is not so much the money. It's the issue of power and authority. The idea that a worker could dare tell me how to run my business, right? Um, and it's very short-sighted. Um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, and then his successors over the next 40 years, stabilized America, right? Put America on a path that it was not going to be attracted to communism or to fascism, which was happening in Europe in the 1930s, by bringing the labor movement, bringing workers into the American system, making them part of the government, investing them in their democracy. And if we want to create a stable nation in the future, that needs to be a priority. Unfortunately, a lot of people have lost the lessons of the New Deal and the lessons of the 1930s, the lessons of World War II. And I hope we don't have to go through some terrible events in our history to relearn those lessons.